Stepdad has one of those weird grandparent names, but nobody knows where it came from because I call my stepdad dad. So when I gave birth for the first time 16 years ago, he was there. When they put my baby into his arms, I said, "Here, go see grandpa." Grandpa is what my kids were supposed to call my stepdad, but they call him Pocket. I don't know why they call him Pocket, but they have always called him Pocket, and he just has never bothered to correct them. It's always been Pocket. And now that my son is older, obviously now, I just said I gave birth 16 years ago. And so his friends all know my dad because he owns a quarter horse ranch and they all go out there to work whenever they need money, right? And it's just so funny to me because for some reason, everybody calls this man Pocket now. Not everybody, as in like his family all calls him Tiger, and then like me and my siblings call him Dad, and my mom called him Shane because his name is Shane. But my son's friends who all know him just call him Pocket. And so on Halloween, my parents were at my house and my son was having his friends over, and every time a new 16-year-old boy would walk in my house, they would look at my dad and they'd be like, "Oh, hey, Pocket." Like, why are you calling that man Pocket? His name is not Pocket. I was at an event at my dad's work and I was wandering around aimlessly looking for my parents. I could not find them anywhere. And suddenly some strange man stops me and he's like, "Hey, are you Shane's daughter?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Oh my gosh, I knew it. You look exactly like your dad." And I'm like, "Okay," because my dad is a big bald biker and I am in fact not big or bald, right? And he's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Jason. I've been friends with your dad for years. I hear so much about you. I feel like I know you already." And I was like, "Okay, cool." And he's like, "Do you know where your parents are? Do you need me to help you find them? Because I'm pretty sure I know where they are." And I'm like, "Yes, please." And so I follow this man around until we turn a corner, and that's when I see them, my big genetic giveaway. Okay, I have these massive dimples and they're genetic, and standing right next to the person who gave them to me is my father because I got them from my mother, and that is 100% how he knew who I was because I look exactly like my mother. I actually could not look like my father at all unless I shaved my head bald because I am his stepdaughter, not his biological daughter. But it is super cute to think about the fact that this guy has been friends with my dad for years and hears so much about me that he feels like he knows me, yet he never heard that I am his stepdaughter, not his biological daughter. I got hit by a truck on Thursday, and I'm sure you're like, "Didn't your dad kill himself last year?" That was my other dad. That was the one I was assigned at birth. He was a fucking loser. So my mom got rid of him, and then she got remarried, and I have always called my stepdad dad since I was a kid. And then when I had my own children, they started calling my stepdad grandpa, and so that is their grandpa. I actually never allowed them to be exposed to my biological father because he was a terrible person. He was the kind of person who would kill himself to ruin his fifth ex-wife's day, okay? And when he did that, my stepdad called me, and he had this really heartfelt conversation with me about how he'll always be here for me. He's my real dad, that DNA doesn't matter, yada, yada, yada. And then literally barely a year later, this motherfucker goes and gets ran down by a truck, okay? And so I am out of state when this happens. I have to fly back to Idaho, and I immediately go to the hospital, and I'm holding his hand, and I'm crying, and I'm talking to him, and he's not responding because he's on a ventilator. He's hooked up to dozens of machines. He has a ton of internal damage. I will not even allow my children to go up and see him in that state because it's so bad, okay? And I'm just crying and talking to him, and suddenly my phone pings, and it's my 16-year-old son, and he says, "Tell grandpa I say 6'7". And so I hold my dad's hand, and I'm like, "Ainsley says 6'7". And I shit you not, this man gets a smirk around his ventilator. He opens his eyes for the first time, then they roll to the back of his head, and he closes his eyes. He ignored all of my heartfelt comments, and then the man-child goes and smirks at a 6'7" joke. Dad got hit by a truck last week, and he's on a ventilator, and I recently watched a video about how if somebody's on a ventilator or on life support, they can still hear you. Even if they're not coherent, if they're not alert, if their eyes aren't open, they can at least still hear you talking to them. So last night I was there visiting him. I was standing with him, holding his hand and talking to him while my mom was in the corner eating dinner. And I was just telling him about my day and what I'd done that day. So I was talking about how I went to work that morning. And then when I was on lunch, I went to the tow yard to try to get some stuff from his motorcycle because he was on his motorcycle when he got hit. He was crossing an intersection and a truck was trying to speed through a flashing yellow turn and sped right into my father and totaled his bike. So it was at the tow yard, and I wanted to get his saddlebags, but the guy at the tow yard wouldn't give me his saddlebags because my dad had bolted them to his motorcycle. And so the guy at the tow yard was saying that that meant they were part of the bike. And I was like, "They're not part of the bike. I bought my dad those saddlebags for Christmas 2 years ago. He got the bike like 20 years ago. The math doesn't math there, buddy." And he still wouldn't give them to me. He said that since the bike was totaled, they now belong to the insurance company. And I wasn't in the mood to argue with him, even though I know I would have won if I would have argued with him, okay? So I started emptying out the saddlebags. I took all of that. I took his lunch pail. And when I opened his lunch pail, I just discovered this man had tuna fish for lunch the day he got hit by a truck. And so it had been roasting in his lunch pail for the last 5 days in 105-degree heat. Absolutely disgusting. I had to completely clean all of that out. And then I went to the local Mexican place and I picked up dinner for me and my mom. And then I went home and I packed it into my dad's lunch pail because I thought it would be cute if I brought it to her in my dad's lunch pail. And while I'm going on and on yapping about this stuff, the nurses come in so that they can move my dad around, because something about pressure, and I know when they do this, it causes him extreme pain because his eyes shoot open. It's like the only time his eyes are open. And so my mom gets up and she runs over so she can be by his side when his eyes open. And when it happened, she rubs his hand and she's like, "Hey, baby, have you been enjoying listening to Cassidy talk?" And my dad looks at her and then he looks at me and then he looked back at her and he shook his head no. And that's how I know that my dad escaped that wreck without any brain damage. I go to the ICU tomorrow so that I can spend some time with my dad. He's on a ventilator because he got hit by a truck, and I just want to spend some time with him on Father's Day, as well as give him his Father's Day gifts, even though he won't be able to see them or understand that I'm bringing him his gifts. It's the thought that counts, and these gifts come with a little extra thought in them because I bought them on June 12th. On June 12th at about 1:15ish, I went to the Harley Davidson store and I was shopping for some Father's Day presents for him because my dad is an avid Harley rider. I walked around for a while, I picked out a few different things, and then I went to the cash register to pay. Now, I paid at exactly 1:40 p.m. and I know this because that is what my receipt says. And then after I left the Harley store, my mom texted me complaining because she had not heard from my dad in a couple hours, and my parents are still grossly in love. They text and they talk on the phone constantly if they're not together. So she knew something was off if he was not texting her for a couple hours. And then very quickly after that, she discovered it was because he had been hit by a truck and was life flighted. And I immediately hopped on to our Facebook community pages because everybody in the town that I live in is super fucking nosy and super gossipy. And there's this lady named Lisa who runs an entire page where she just spends all day posting everything she finds interesting from our local police scanners for the entire county. So I wanted to see if she had posted anything about my dad's wreck on there and if I could get any details from it. And so I go and I find a wreck that happened that day right on the intersection of a highway near where my parents live. And I look at the police scanner records and it happened at exactly 1:40 p.m. So at exactly 1:40 p.m., I was at the Harley shop paying for my dad's Father's Day presents. And at exactly 1:40 p.m., my dad was on his Harley getting hit by a truck. And when the casket goes, I cry. In my heart, you live forever. Officially 0 for 2 on dads. My biological dad killed himself last year because he got mad at his wife and he was trying to hurt her feelings and ruin her day or whatever. And then my stepdad, who is actually who raised me, and that's who I've called dad for the majority of my life, he was like, "Oh, don't worry about him. He was never your real dad. I was always your real dad, regardless of what DNA says, and you'll always still have me." And then a fucking year later, this dude gets hit by a truck and he's been on a ventilator for the last 9 days. And I did not let my kids go to see him because my dad was a great grandpa. He was a proud grandpa. He was a great dad, but like he lived to be a grandpa. That was his thing. That's the thing he was most proud of. And he would not want my children to see him the way that he was. He looked like he had been hit by a truck because he was hit by a fucking truck, right? And so I chose to let their last memories of him not be him fighting for his life. And so now my children's last memories of my dad, their last interaction with him, was the day before he got hit by the truck. And my sons and I and my mother were actually in Vegas at the time. My mom was in our room and she was laying on the hotel bed next to my son who was sitting there playing on his phone, and my mom's phone started ringing. It was my dad, and she answered it and she was like, "Hey, baby." And then her and my dad start like grossly flirting because my parents are still grossly in love. We're still grossly in love. And so they're like sitting there grossly flirting on the phone while both of my kids are sitting right next to my mom. And my older son looks at me and just mouths the word ew. And my younger son is like fake gagging. And so their last memories of my dad are how much he loved their grandmother. Dad was just killed by a truck driver who didn't understand when and why to yield for bikers. So I'm going to explain this scenario for you so anybody who doesn't know and doesn't understand can learn, because maybe if more people know and more people understand this, less people will have dead dads because of it. So the scenario for my dad's case here is that my dad was passing straight through an intersection and there was a guy in a truck who was trying to turn on a flashing yellow in that intersection. Now, my dad's light turned yellow, but at that intersection, my dad, the speed on that road was 55 miles per hour. So something to keep in mind is, per the law, if you can stop safely at a yellow, you should stop safely at that yellow. If you're on a motorcycle and you are going over 25 miles per hour and that light turns yellow, you cannot stop safely at that yellow, because you can't abruptly stop on a motorcycle and it be safe. You're putting your life at risk if you do that, especially if you are being tailgated. So if you are waiting at a flashing yellow to turn and you see a motorcyclist coming and they're on a yellow, there is a high chance they are not stopping for the yellow. And it's not because they're a speed demon. It's not because they're trying to race the yellow. It's because it is not safe for them to abruptly stop their bike at the speed they're going to hit that, to miss that yellow, to stop for that yellow, okay? So your job with your flashing yellow light is to yield for that oncoming traffic. Do not go because the biker cannot stop. Today, my dad was killed by a negligent truck driver, and ever since that day, multiple times a day, every single day, people are sending me their condolences, they're apologizing, they're saying they're sorry, and it just makes me feel so awkward because they don't have any reason to apologize to me or say that they're sorry. They didn't do anything wrong. There's one person who did something wrong and needs to apologize to me, and that is the man who was cited for improperly turning just a few years before he improperly turned into and killed my father, and he has failed to do so. He has not made any attempt to reach out or to apologize to me for killing my father. And so anytime anybody else apologizes to me, it just doesn't hit the same that it should because he hasn't. And so my dark humor takes over, and the first thing that immediately comes out of my mouth every single time somebody says they're sorry is, why? You didn't hit my dad with a truck. And yesterday I was at dinner with my mom, and she started telling me the story about my dad, which made me get all teary-eyed. And then she looked at me and she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. And so there it goes. My dark humor immediately pops out of my mouth, and it's like, why? You didn't hit my dad with a truck. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, because that's the love of her life that I'm talking about. But instead of getting upset, my mom gets this smirk on her face, and she explains to me that back in the day, if you didn't know, when my mom was in her 20s, her father was shot and killed. He was murdered. And she told me that for the first few months after this happened, every single time somebody apologized to her, it was her first response to immediately say, why? You didn't shoot my daddy. And I guess that shows that dark humor is genetic.